The first time I walked out of the examination building, I felt lighter than air. Not because I had suddenly become a genius. I was still Lin Chao, the long-term tenant of the bottom half of class 12-7, a girl whose scores were so stable that even my homeroom teacher said I had the soul of a bureaucrat. I never rose high enough to inspire anyone, and I never dropped low enough to scare my parents into hiring a tutor. I was the kind of student who could miss 3 points on a multiple choice question with a serenity that bordered on philosophy. But that afternoon, after finishing the first day of the national entrance exam, I had the strange confidence of someone who had survived a storm and found that the roof was still there. The Chinese essay topic had been ugly. Mathematics had looked like it wanted to stab me. And English reading had been written by what I assumed was a bitter foreigner who hated 17-year-olds. Still, I had written everything I could. The paper was not glorious, but it was alive. In my world, that counted as a victory. I crossed the hallway with the other students, passed through the security line, and stepped beyond the iron school gate where parents crowded in the evening heat with umbrellas, mineral water, and faces full of fear and hope. My mother was waving both hands like she was trying to guide a plane onto a runway. My father was standing beside her with a cigarette he clearly did not dare to light, pretending he was calm and failing at it in a way only fathers can. I raised my arm to call out. My foot landed beyond the threshold. Darkness dropped over me like a curtain. I opened my eyes to the electric clock on my bedroom wall. June 6th, 9:30 p.m. The night before the exam. For a full 10 seconds, I lay there motionless, staring at the numbers until they blurred. Then I sat up so fast I nearly headbutted the top bunk rail that had been there since middle school and which, according to my mother, would stay in my room until I married, had grandchildren, and died. The door was open. The television was on outside. The smell of sliced oranges and peppermint floated in from the living room. I ran out barefoot. My mother was leaning against my father's shoulder, eating a segment of orange while he peeled another one with the concentration of a bomb technician. The fan was turning overhead. The plastic tablecloth had the same oil stain from last week's braised pork. Everything was so ordinary that my scalp prickled. My mother looked up first. "Why are you out here? Aren't you supposed to be sleeping?" "You are taking the exam tomorrow." I blinked at her. "Tomorrow," my father frowned. "What do you mean tomorrow?" "Don't tell me you have already failed in your dreams." "I already took it," I said. "I took the first day." The math paper was disgusting. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at my mother. Then my mother reached out and touched my forehead. "He is not hot. Maybe the brain cooked first," my father said. I ignored them. The essay topic was about endurance. The first big math proof used a recursive sequence. I know because I wrote half of it wrong. "Wonderful," my father said. "He has started inventing details. I'm not inventing anything." My mother folded her arms. "Then explain why you're standing in our living room wearing pajamas on the night before the exam." I had no explanation. That was the problem. I went back to my room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of my bed staring at my desk. My admission ticket lay there under the lamp, exactly where I had placed it. My sharpened pencils were lined up like obedient soldiers. My half-finished bottle of tea was still cold. I pinched my own arm hard enough to hiss. It hurt. Not a dream. Not a joke. Not exhaustion. After 10 minutes of spiraling, like a loose washing machine drum, I did the only thing available to a student in crisis. I opened my math notebook. There was one large proof question from the afternoon paper that I still remembered clearly. I could picture the sequence, the conditions, the final conclusion I had nearly reached before time ran out. My memory was imperfect but not empty. If this was real, if for some impossible reason I had truly returned to the night before the exam, then memory was no longer
nostalgia.
It was inventory. I stayed up until midnight reconstructing the proof. Then I lay down fully dressed and slept like someone waiting for a verdict. The next morning, my alarm rang at 6. As if nothing in the universe had broken, my mother made noodles with egg and tomatoes. My father drove me to school. At the last intersection, he tapped the steering wheel and said, "Don't panic. Even if you bomb it, there are thousands of roads after this one." I almost laughed in his face. Thousands of roads, I would have settled for one. At the school gate, I stood still for 3 seconds, staring at the iron bars and the inspection line and the crowd of students entering with transparent bags and transparent faces. Everything was exactly the same, down to the boy in front, of me dropping his ruler and swearing under his breath. When the paper was distributed, I turned it over with hands that were shaking so hard I almost tore the corner. The same essay prompt, the same first proof, the same multiple choice question with the answer I had agonized over, the same exam. My heart began to pound so violently that the room went white at the edges. I took a breath, then another. Then I lowered my head and started writing. That day I wrote like a woman fleeing a burning building. The proof I had reconstructed overnight landed on the page in clean, decisive steps. My essay flowed. My reading comprehension no longer looked like a foreign conspiracy. I finished early, checked my name, checked my number, checked the answer sheet, checked them again, then sat there trying not to grin like a criminal. When the bell rang, I walked out with deliberate calm. At the gate, my mother waved. My father crushed the unlit cigarette in his fist. My foot crossed the threshold. Darkness, June 6th, 9:30 p.m. Again, I did not scream. I wanted to. Instead, I sat down on the floor between my bed and desk and pressed both palms against my eyes until stars exploded. In the dark, then I laughed. It was not a healthy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that begins in disbelief and ends somewhere near surrender. I had done better. I had improved the paper. I had even written the essay with a proper opening instead of my usual blunt force attack. And none of it mattered, because the world had folded me back into the same night, like a letter returned to sender. The third loop, I memorized more. The fourth, I stopped pretending this was temporary. The fifth, I began to study the exam like a thief studying a safe. At first, I memorized answers, then patterns, then the small details that clung to the day like lint. The invigilator with a cough every 22 minutes. The girl in front of me who tapped her pen 3 times before every reading passage. The crack in the wall near the last window. The way the ceiling fan above the left aisle squeaked 1 rotation in 5. Soon I started testing the edges. On one loop, I left home 20 minutes earlier and bought sweet soy milk from the corner stall. On another, I left later and arrived with barely 5 minutes to spare, running so hard that one of the insoles in my shoes slid out and nearly abandoned me at the stairs. On another, I took the bus instead of my father's car. On another, I asked my classmate Sunmay to slap me in the face during the break between papers. She did too, with impressive dedication. Nothing changed, no matter what I did, as long as I lived through the afternoon and stepped beyond the school gate after the exam. The world folded shut and sent me back to the night. For a while, I thought I could use the loop to become invincible. That thought lasted exactly 9 cycles, because the first time you discover you can relive the same exam, it feels like cheating fate the 10th time. It feels like being buried alive in paper. I began to understand that repetition and freedom were not the same thing. A locked room with perfect lighting was still a locked room. I tried skipping the exam. That ended badly. I woke up, ate breakfast, put on my uniform, waited until my father went to move the car, and then hit on the rooftop of our building with a bottle of water, half, a loaf of bread, and a tragic amount of confidence. If the gate was the trigger, then maybe I could simply refuse the exam itself. Maybe the loop required my participation. Maybe breaking the sequence would break the mechanism. At noon, my mother found me because a neighbor saw that Lynn girl sitting on the water tank like a lonely crow. At 1:30, my father dragged me downstairs by the ear. At 2, they delivered me to school. Like a special package labeled handle with carelessness. I missed the Chinese paper entirely. I sat through mathematics in a state of philosophical collapse, filled half the answer sheet with apologies to future archaeologists, and walked out certain that this time, the world would have no reason to continue the performance. My foot crossed the gate. Darkness, June 6th, 9:30 p.m. I started to hate the clock. Then I tried leaving the exam early. One loop, I stood up during mathematics, informed the invigilator that I was surrendering my future to the universe, and walked out. Before the final half hour, she stared at me as if I were a goat that had learned to speak. The chief examiner nearly followed me into the corridor. I reached the gate before the other students, stepped through alone, and waited for either liberation or lightning. Darkness, June 6th, 9:30 p.m. Then I tried not crossing the gate at all. I spent one whole evening, after the exam, sitting on the low flower bed near the administration building, watching the parents leave, the sun sink, and the campus security guards change shifts. At 7:30, the mosquitoes found me. At 8:15, a guard asked whether I had lost my soul or merely my transport. At 9:30, the campus lights dimmed. At 9:31, with both feet still inside school grounds, darkness still came, so the gate was not the cause. It was only the last familiar thing I remembered before being reset. That was the first thought that truly frightened me. If the gate was not the cause, then maybe this had never been about the gate at all. Maybe the exam was only the room my mind had chosen because it was the one room I refused to leave unfinished. Once that idea entered, others followed. What if I was not trapped in time? What if I was trapped in myself? That would have been a useful insight if it came with instructions. It did not, so I kept moving. By the 12th loop, I could have scored frighteningly well on the actual papers. By the 15th, I had stopped feeling proud of that fact. I was memorizing questions to survive, not to excel, and survival without forward motion curdles into something ugly very fast. By the 18th, I knew every pothole, from my building to the school gate. I knew which tea shop played old rock music in the morning and which grandmother watered her basil at exactly 6:48. I knew that the boy selling newspapers at the intersection had a chipped front tooth and that he hid comic books under the third stack on the right. I knew the way the city breathed before the exam and the way it sighed after. And somewhere in all that knowledge there was a hole, a missing thing, a blank. Not in the papers, but in the city itself. The clue arrived from my father, without him knowing he had given it. One evening over dinner, after I had spent the whole afternoon staring silently at a bowl of eggplant as if it had insulted my ancestors, he said, "You used to walk faster when you were little, took mulberry steps every day and flew home like you had fire on your back." I looked up. Mulberry, what? He blinked. Mulberry Steps, the old stone stairway that cuts between Spring Canal Road and East Paper Street. There is no stairway there. He snorted. Of course there is. I carried sacks of flour up those steps for half a year when the bakery truck was broken. You used to race ahead and wait at the top. I have never seen it. My mother looked from him to me. That is because they redeveloped that area years ago, is not it? No, my father said slowly. The shops changed. The steps stayed. I opened the map app on my phone. No Mulberry Steps. I searched with 3 different spellings, then by landmarks, then by old district name. Nothing. Spring Canal Road and East Paper Street were there, but no connecting stairway. According to the map, there was simply a strip of buildings pressed shoulder to shoulder between them. The next morning, I went looking. Spring Canal Road was exactly where it should be. So was East Paper Street. Between them, there was a wall of small shops, shuttered. locksmith, a herbal tea stand, and an alley so narrow a cat would have had to turn sideways. No steps. I asked the tea seller, an auntie with yellow gloves and a voice like sandpaper. Excuse me, where are mulberry steps? She frowned. Where mulberry steps? The stone stairway between these two roads. There is no stairway. She pointed to the alley. If you want Westcott, go through there. I went through. It opened onto a delivery yard full of crates and one very offended goose. I came back out and asked a fruit vendor. Mulberry steps, he said. Oh, you mean Willow Rise? Keep walking south. I walked south. I found a dead end. 3 potted lemons and a barber, who charged twice market price for a bad haircut. On the 3rd loop, I asked 6 different people and got 6 different answers. One sent me north. One sent me west. One said I meant Bell Slope. One insisted I meant the pedestrian overpass near the bus depot. One stared at me, spat sunflower seed shells, and said, young people name every road after a coffee shop now. How should I know? By the 5th attempt, I realized the problem was not that nobody knew the place. The problem was that nobody agreed on what it was called. That evening, I took a taxi. Mulberry Steps, I told the driver. He adjusted the mirror. Which end? My heart kicked once, hard. You know it. Of course I know it. Been driving 20 years. Get in. I did. 10 minutes later, he pulled up in front of a flight of concrete stairs beside the overpass near the bus depot. This is Bell Rise, I said. He twisted around in his seat.
No, this is Mulberry Steps.
It absolutely is not. He looked offended. Miss, if you know better, why are you taking a taxi?
Fair.
On the next loop, I took the same driver again, but this time I kept my map open and watched the route. He followed exactly the same path. When he stopped at the overpass stairs, I paid anyway, got out, and stood there under the burning sun, staring at the wrong place while sweat slid down the middle of my back, a place that everyone knew and no one named the same way. A place my father spoke of as ordinary, but which my own memory touched only as blank air. Something in me tightened. That afternoon, wandering in circles through streets that smelled of frying oil and rainless heat, I found her. She was sitting under the railway arch beside a folding table no bigger than a chopping board. Her hair was silver and neatly braided. Her eyes were white with blindness. Before her lay a tray of carved seals, tiny red squares, and slips of paper weighted down with bolts because the passing trains shook everything loose. A cardboard sign leaned against the table. Carve a name, keep a memory. I stopped because I had begun stopping for everything. In loops, meaningless details are often the only doors available. She did not lift her head. You have come by 6 times. I froze. You can tell. I can smell the same panic. She smiled faintly. Sit. I sat. Her hands were narrow, stained with cinnabar and ink. On the tray were seals, carved with ordinary names, surnames, pet names, shop names, names that looked chosen for babies and names that looked chosen for dogs. She touched each one like it mattered. What do you carve? I asked. Things people do not want forgotten. Does it work? Sometimes. Usually it only reminds them what they already refuse to lose. The train thundered overhead. Dust trembled from the arch. Somewhere close by a child laughed. I hesitated, then asked, if a place keeps slipping away from you, is it because you forgot it or because it does not want to be found? She angled her face toward me. That depends. Are you looking for the place itself, or the part of you that vanished there? The word slid under my skin so cleanly it felt surgical. I do not know, I admitted. You do. You just do not like the answer. I almost stood up and left. Instead, I stayed because I had nowhere else to go. There is a stairway between 2 roads, I said. At least there should be. My father swears it exists. Nobody calls it the same thing. I can't find it, and I think I swallowed. I think it might be. connected to what is happening to me.
What is happening to you?
I looked at her hands, not her face. The same 2 days keep repeating. The days of the exam. She was silent for so long that embarrassment began to flood me. Then she reached under the table, took out a small folding stool, and set it beside mine. "Come tomorrow," she said.
Bring tea?
The old surveyor likes to hear himself talk, and I do not have the energy to entertain him empty-handed. The next loop I came back with jasmine tea. The old surveyor turned out to be a man named Han, whose spine curved like a question mark and whose memory, unlike his knees, remained offensively sharp. He met us in the small public park behind the arch, where he sat under a persimmon tree with a canvas tube of rolled city plans and the self-importance of someone who had once measured the world for money. Mulberry Steps, he told me, had existed long before my district, had apartment towers, coffee chains, or moral decay. They were old when I was young, he said. Stone steps built up the slope before the new roads were cut. Traders used them. School children used them. Delivery boys used them. Lovers used them. People used them when they were in a hurry, which is the only true sign of a useful road.
So where are they?
He looked at me over thick glasses.
Right, where they have always been.
That is not helpful. No, Madame Shu said mildly. It is simply accurate. Old Han unrolled one of his plans across the bench. It was not a tourist map or a phone screenshot. It was a survey sheet, yellowed at the edges, gridded, and precise the city laid out. In ink and pencil and corrections, he tapped a finger between Spring, Canal Road, and East Paper Street.
There.
A narrow zigzag cut through the block. My throat tightened. Why is not it on current maps?
Han snorted.
Because current maps are made by people with offices, not knees. They draw what can be counted, sold, and insured. A place like that, old, inconvenient, tied to too many small stories, gets absorbed into the blank. That does not explain why nobody calls it the same name. Madame Sue lifted her chin. Maybe it was always more than one thing. A road has its official name, the name children use, the
name old people refuse to surrender,
the name lovers whisper, the name delivery men curse, the name shopkeepers write on receipts.
Which one is the real one?
I opened my mouth, closed it. Han rolled up the plan. If you want to find it, stop asking the city. Ask your own feet. That annoyed me so much I nearly laughed. My feet, you said your father carried flour up those steps. You said you used to raise him. You do not need a map. You need memory.
Memory.
The word hung between us like a threat. On the 26th loop, I went back to the area and stopped trying to find the steps with reason. I stood on Spring Canal, rode with my eyes closed, and tried to imagine what my father had described. The weight of flour sacks, the smell of yeast, my own shorter legs on hot stone, the cheap school bag cutting across my shoulder. The childish hunger that makes home smell stronger when you are near it. Nothing. A horn blared behind me, because I was standing in the middle of the bike lane like a tragic public sculpture. On the 27th loop I came, with an old photo album from home. Most of the pictures were terrible blurred birthdays, overexposed vacations, my father's thumb covering half the lens in any image taken before I was 10, but buried near the back was a photo of me, aged maybe 8, grinning with missing front teeth, school bag on my back, standing beside a stone lion whose nose had broken off. Behind me rose 3 worn steps and the beginning of a narrow climb between walls. I stared at the picture. So long my mother asked whether I had finally found a way to improve my face through
nostalgia.
The stone lion. The next morning, I went straight to East Paper Street. There was no stairway, but there was, beside a closed locksmith shop, a chipped stone block pressed against the wall, so naturally it might have been a planter, if not for the broken curve of a lion's mane. My pulse began to hammer. I touched the stone, hot under the sun.
rough with grit.
Real. I stepped back and looked around. People brushed past me carrying breakfast buns and parcels, none of them glancing twice. To them, it was only wall, shopfront, alley, traffic. To me, suddenly, it was a sentence with one word missing. I put my hand on the stone, lion again, and said quietly, Mulberry Steps. Nothing happened. I felt foolish, then angrier than foolishness deserved. Mulberry Steps, I said again, louder. A delivery cyclist nearly ran into me. Miss, who are you yelling at?
Not him.
Not the city, not even the stone. I closed my eyes and pictured my father's voice, careless and certain. You used to take Mulberry Steps every day and fly home like you had fire on your back. My feet shifted. Left foot angled inward, right foot tested a rise. Where flat pavement should have been, my hand followed the wall and suddenly did not meet brick. It met open air. I opened my eyes. The stairway was there, not materializing out of magic, not descending from clouds, simply there as if it had become embarrassed by my persistence and stepped out. From behind its own name, stone steps, narrow and worn down. In the middle by decades of feet. Walls close on both sides, patched with ivy and old plaster, a rusted railing on the left. Laundry lines above, sun cut into pieces by overhead wires. It was at once utterly ordinary and so impossible that I could only stand there and stare. People still passed on the street behind me. No one looked in. No one shouted. No one seemed to see that a road had just returned. I stepped onto the first stone. The world tilted. The smell hit first, not the hot oil and dust of the main road, but something damp, mineral, old.
Not decay. Memory.
I climbed. On the third landing, my chest hurt. On the fifth, I heard a sound like laughter that might have been a child or might have been the squeal of a brake. On the seventh, I stopped because I knew with the certainty of a nightmare completing itself that I had been here recently. Not as a child. Recently, the thought cracked something open. Rain, a morning sky the color of unwashed steel, my exam admission ticket tucked into the clear pouch with my pencils. My mother behind me at the door saying, "Eat the egg." An exam day without egg is unlucky. My father downstairs arguing with a stalled scooter. The main road flooded because water main had burst before dawn. Traffic diverted. Too many people, too much time bleeding away. And me thinking in blunt, practical panic, take the steps. I grabbed the railing now because the memory came with such force my knees weakened. I had been late. Not very late, but enough to feel the exam breathing down my neck like a dog. I had cut through Mulberry Steps. And halfway down the opposite side, near the old drainage run, beside the stone lion with the broken nose, I had seen a little boy chasing a paper windmill that had slipped from his hand. The windmill skittered into the lower runnel. The boy leaned after it. At the same moment, above us on the service road, an electric freight cart lost control on the wet slope. I remembered the sound before anything else. A thin mechanical scream. Tires without grip. Metal too light to stop itself. I dropped my bag. I ran. The boy turned because I shouted. His shoe slipped on algae slick stone. I lunged, grabbed the back of his shirt, and threw him sideways behind the lion. The cart hit the railing. The railing snapped. After that, everything became impact. The cart slammed into the stair edge and tipped. Something heavy struck my shoulder and head. My cheek hit stone. I tasted blood and rain. Above me, people were screaming. Someone was pulling the child away. My admission ticket, wet and translucent, had fluttered from the pouch and stuck to the broken railing just out of reach. I had stared at it with a single thought in my skull, stupid and bright as lightning. My exam. Then the thought that came after, quieter and more terrifying. If I miss it, everything ends. I sat down hard on the step and put both hands over my face. For a long time, I breathed, like someone recovering from a blow, because that was what it was. Not revelation. Impact delayed. I had not simply been reliving the exam because it was important. I had been reliving the last unfinished edge of myself. The last fear I had carried into the dark. Not pain, not death,
Failure.
not even true failure either. Anticipated failure, imagined ruin, the certainty that missing one exam would erase every road after it. A bitter laugh escaped me.
Of course.
Of course that would be the chain. I climbed the rest of the stairway slowly and found myself at the upper exit, where a faded mulberry tree still leaned over the wall of an abandoned printing shop. Its roots had split part of the pavement. Purple-black stains marked the stone where fruit had fallen in previous seasons. I touched the trunk. The bark was cool. At the top of the steps there was a plaque nearly hidden by grime. Mulberry Steps, repaired 1998. I almost cried from the sheer stupid tenderness of it. The road had been waiting with its name written, plainly in metal, while I rotted in repetition below. That afternoon, I went back to Madame Chu. She listened without interrupting while I told her everything I remembered. When I finished, she poured tea into 2 cracked cups and pushed one toward me. So, she said, now you know why the road matters. I had an accident.
Yes.
I might be in a coma.
Probably.
I may have missed the real exam. Almost certainly. I put my head in my hands. Then what am I supposed to do? I found the place. I remembered.
Why am I still here?
Madame Chu did not answer immediately. At length she said, because finding the locked door is not the same as deciding to leave the room. I lifted my head. What does that mean? It means, she said, that your mind built itself a world where the worst thing could be rehearsed until it was no
Longer. Frightening.
You kept taking the exam because you thought the right paper, the right score, the right answer could buy you a future. Again, maybe that was comforting at first. Maybe now it is only another form of fear. I stared at the tea. A leaf floated on the surface like a drowned insect. If I wake up, I said carefully, I might lose the exam.
If you stay, she replied, you will lose everything else.
Han, who had been dozing on the neighboring bench, opened one eye. A perfect rehearsal is still not a life. I wanted to argue. Instead, I found myself laughing again. But this time it was tired, not wild. You know what is ridiculous, I said. If this were about courage, I thought it would be the courage to save someone, or to face death, or to walk onto a hidden road. But apparently it is the courage to be ordinary and uncertain and still go on. Madame Chu's blind gaze settled exactly where my eyes were. That is harder than heroics for most people. The next several loops passed in a different color. I still sat the papers. Habit is a powerful animal, but the greed went out of it. I no longer hoarded questions as if they were oxygen. Instead, I noticed what the repetition had given me besides panic, time. In a normal life, time is always running ahead of you, slamming doors. In the loop, doors held. I had used that mercy to memorize exams.
Yes, but also
To learn things I had never really understood. I relearned analytic geometry from the first. Line up because boredom had eventually become discipline. I solved the same recursive sequence problem 5 different ways. I asked the chemistry teacher, a question I had been too embarrassed to ask for 3 months. Then came back another loop and asked a harder one. I spent one whole cycle in the library reading model essays, not because they would appear on the paper, but because I finally had enough time to see how argument and rhythm sat together. I discovered that the subject I truly hated was not mathematics or language or physics. It was helplessness. Knowledge, even slow knowledge, was one antidote. By the time I reached what I later counted as the 43rd loop, my scores on the repeated exam had become almost irrelevant. I could do the papers, yes. More importantly, I had become someone who could do many papers. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made the next step unavoidable. I had to stop. Not stop the loop if I knew how to do that. I would have done it weeks ago. I had to stop bargaining with it. on what became my final day inside it. I woke up before the alarm. The clock read 5:58 a.m. The room was blue with not yet morning. Outside, a stray dog barked once and fell silent. I sat up and looked at my desk.
Admission ticket.
Transparent pouch, pencils, everything in order. My first instinct was still to check the math notebook. To revise once more, to confirm one more time that I could nail the proof. Perfect the essay. Make use of the impossible gift. I watched that instinct rise, then pass. When I went into the kitchen, my mother was already up boiling noodles. She turned, couldn't sleep.
I shook my head.
She ladled broth into a bowl and pushed it toward me.
Eat.
Your father says a full stomach makes brave hearts. That is not what he says, I murmured. She smiled. No. What he actually says is that hunger makes people stupid. I laughed despite myself. My father drove me in. Silence until the last light, then said, whatever happens, come back with your own face. Don't borrow someone else's. I had heard him say something close to that before, but not in these exact words. Or maybe he had always meant this, and I had only just learned how to listen. At school, the crowds pressed in. The gates opened. Teachers shouted. Parents hovered like weather. I went through everything as usual. Security. Classroom. Paper. I wrote, not perfectly, deliberately, on the essay, instead of the polished, unnatural version I had, refined across loops. I wrote the one that felt truer even, though it was rougher about repetition, about fear disguised as preparation, about the difference between control and courage. It was risky. It was also mine. When the bell rang, I did not rush. I walked out of the building and across the courtyard. Students streamed toward the gates, hungry for release. Beyond them, parents already waved water bottles in hope. I stopped halfway. Then I turned around. No one noticed one more. Tired student cutting across the campus toward the rear wall, climbing the service steps, slipping through the broken fence panel near the old printing annex, and heading for Mulberry Steps. The city behind the school was quieter there. Laundry moved in the heat. A bicycle bell chimed once. Somewhere, a radio played an old song with too much static. I descended the upper half of the steps, then stood at the place where the railing had broken in my memory. The air thickened. Rain smell, though the day was dry. Metal scream. The weight of the moment before impact. I closed my eyes. When I spoke, I was not speaking to the road, or to the city, or even to whatever force had wound the last 2 days around me until they strangled. I was speaking to myself. If I wake up and miss the exam, I said, I will live. My voice shook. I kept going. If I wake up and the paper is gone, I will still live. The words felt harder than any proof I had written. If I lose this one road, I will find another one. If I lose one exam, I will take another. If no one gives me another, I will build something from the years after. But I'm going back. The wind moved through the mulberry leaves above me. For a second, nothing happened. Then the sounds of the city peeled away. I heard a monitor beeping, a shoe squeaking on hospital floor. My mother crying with the discipline of someone trying not to wake the patient. The world tipped forward, and I woke. The first thing I saw was white ceiling. The second was my father, asleep in a chair with his chin on his chest, one hand still hanging over the side of my bed as if he had refused to let go. Even in sleep, my head felt packed with sand. My shoulder ached in layers. There was tape on my arm, and the room smelled of saline and old worry. I made a sound. My father jerked upright so violently the chair nearly went over. He stared at me. Then he shouted for my mother with enough force to frighten the entire corridor. People ran in, nurses, a doctor, my mother with tears already breaking free. Somewhere behind them a little boy cried because strangers in hospitals always cry when adults do. The next few hours blurred. Questions, lights in my eyes, names, pain scales. Can you feel this? Can you move that? Do you know what day it is? When I finally had enough breath to speak more than a syllable at a time, I asked the only question that had mattered for what felt like a century. The exam, my mother started crying harder. My father took my hand. You have been unconscious 13 days. 13. The number should have shocked me more than it did. Instead, it slid into place. As if my body had known it all along and simply forgotten to tell me. I missed it, I said. You saved a child, my mother replied fiercely. As if scolding fate itself. You hear me. You saved him.
He is fine.
His family comes every day. That mattered. It did, but I still turned my head and cried so quietly it barely counted as sound. Not because I had learned nothing, because I had finally learned enough to understand exactly what I had lost. The days after waking were a different kind of repetition. Medication, physical therapy,
Soup.
sleep, visitors,
Pain.
the rescued boy, named Lele, came with his grandfather carrying fruit and apologies and gratitude that looked too big for the room. He hid behind the old man's leg at first, then peered out and said, Sister, I'm sorry about your test. I laughed so suddenly it hurt my stitches. He gave me a paper windmill with uneven blue blades. I kept it by the bed. On the 4th day after waking, a representative from the Education Bureau came. There are moments in life when adults clear their throats in a particular way that makes you understand news is about to change shape. This was one of those moments. Because my injury had occurred while traveling to the exam, because it had been documented, because my hospitalization had made attendance impossible, and because the rescue had become a local news story after. Someone's dashcam caught part of the cart accident. I would be permitted to sit for the deferred national examination, a replacement paper, a lawful second chance, not the paper from the loop, not a memory test, a real sealed deferred exam for students with extraordinary circumstances. My father looked at me as if waiting to see whether I would break from relief or pressure. Neither happened. Instead, something very quiet settled inside me. I had wanted one impossible certainty and been denied it. What I got instead was a human chance. This time, astonishingly, that felt enough. Recovery took another 6 weeks. I was not allowed to study at first, which nearly killed me more efficiently than the accident had.
Then the doctor said light reading was acceptable.
And my mother came back from the bookstore with enough review materials to build a defensive wall. My teachers visited in shifts. My Chinese teacher pretended she had only come to drop off fruit, then spent an hour explaining how to make an argument. Breathe. My mathematics teacher brought 3 years of deferred paper style problems and said, in a tone of excessive restraint, I hear you have recently become willing to suffer. My classmates sent voice messages ranging from sincere encouragement to threats that if I entered Tsinghua, ahead of them they would demand repayment and hot pot.
Sun Mei,
who had once slapped me in a loop that technically never existed, sent a paragraph so emotional my mother cried. Reading it aloud, I studied, not like before the accident, when studying had been something I avoided until panic cornered me, and not like in the loop, when studying had become both weapon and prison. I studied because now I understood what effort felt like when it was chosen. I rose at 7, did rehab exercises until my shoulders stopped insulting me and worked in blocks.
mathematics,
Chinese, English, physics,
Rest.
more mathematics because the world respects neither dignity nor preference. The strangest part was this. What had once felt impossible now often felt familiar. Not because the deferred paper would repeat, because in the loop I had been forced, by boredom and terror and time, to lay down a foundation brick by brick, until I could finally stand on it. When I worked a hard proof now, I no longer had the panicked sense of staring at a locked gate. I had methods, angles, patience. Not unlimited, but real. Sometimes, usually in the hour before sleep, fear returned. What if the deferred paper was harder? What if the loop knowledge had already faded into dream?
what if I had mistaken?
Endurance for growth and was still. Beneath all this drama, merely Lin Chao of the lower middle. Ranks, trying to cosplay a myth. When that happened, I would think of mulberry steps, of the road that existed, whether or not the city agreed on its name, of Madame Xu saying a perfect rehearsal was still not a life, and I would go back to the page in front of me. The day of the deferred exam arrived in early August. The air-conditioned hall was much smaller than the original school campus. There were only 12 of us, each with our own improbable story. Illness, accidents, disasters, bureaucratic nightmares, no cheering parents,
No television vans.
no crowd of thousands carrying expectation like a second sky. Just desks, clock, paper, breath. When the first sheet was placed before me, my fingers tightened once. Then I looked at the questions. They were not the loop papers. They were not easier. And for the first time, that did not frighten me. I lowered my head and began. The essay was about irreversible choices. I almost laughed. Mathematics included a proof that moved sideways instead of forward. The kind of problem that punishes memorization and rewards structural understanding. 2 months earlier, I would have cursed it. Now I paused, sketched the dependencies, and felt the answer begin to gather. English reading was still written by people who clearly did not want adolescents to feel joy. Physics tried to commit manslaughter with one rotational dynamics question. I did not dominate every subject. I was not transformed into a saint of numbers. There were moments of hesitation, moments of doubt, moments when I had to let one question go and trust the rest. But when the bell rang and I set down my pen, the feeling inside me was entirely different from the first exam, and from any loop after. Not relief alone. Completion. No reset followed. I left the building slowly, half expecting darkness to swallow the world for old time's sake.
Outside, my parents stood under a plane tree because
They had arrived too early, as they always did. My mother held a thermos. My father held an expression carefully constructed to look casual and failing in the same old way. I crossed the threshold. Sunlight, traffic,
heat.
the ordinary world remained. My mother reached me first.
How was it? I took the thermos and drank. Then I said the truest thing available.
It was hard. My father nodded, satisfied.
Good.
Things worth doing usually are. The results came 3 weeks later. By then, I had learned that suspense, unlike time loops, does not become easier through understanding. On the morning score release was scheduled. I paced grooves into the apartment tiles until my mother threatened to tie me to a chair. My father refreshed the website. So often the router seemed personally insulted. Even my little cousin, who had no grasp of university entrance, systems whatsoever, called to ask whether I was already famous. When the page finally loaded, no one spoke for a full second. My mother was the first to make a sound, and it was not language. My father sat down very abruptly. I looked again because numbers on screens are dangerous things and should never be trusted without repetition. Then I laughed. Then I cried. Then, because human dignity is fragile, I laughed while crying and scared the cousin enough that he began crying through the phone. From sheer confusion. My score was not perfect. It was better. Not numerically better than perfection, my Chinese remained too human. For that, but better in the only way that mattered, it was enough for Tsinghua. More than enough. According to my mathematics teacher, who called and shouted into the receiver, "You absolute menace, I knew the sequence. Questions would not defeat you." For 3 days, my home filled with noise. Relatives, teachers, neighbors, fruit baskets, cakes, messages from classmates who swung wildly. Between congratulations and accusations of concealed identity, someone hung a banner across our balcony that said, "Our building produces talent," which was factually unsupported but emotionally useful. My father bought too many crabs. My mother cried every time someone said my name in a respectful tone. I slipped away on the 4th day and went looking for mulberry steps. This time it took me less than 3 minutes. Not because the city had changed, because I had, at the bottom of the steps, near the chipped lion, a new small sign had been installed by the district office after the accident. Mulberry steps. Caution in wet weather. It was both laughably inadequate and deeply moving. At the top landing, Madame Xu sat under the mulberry tree with her seal box open. "You look heavier," she said before I spoke. "That is rude. That means you are healthy." I sat beside her. Han arrived later, carrying a newspaper in which someone had circled my name 3 times. He pretended not to be proud and failed about as elegantly as my father. We drank tea. The city buzzed below. After a while, I asked, "Did you know from the beginning what was happening to me?" Madame Xu ran her fingers over an unfinished seal. "Enough to guess. Not enough to replace your own understanding. You could have just told me,
And if I had,
you would have treated it like another answer sheet. Something to memorize rather than live." Annoyingly, she was right. Han tapped the newspaper against his knee. Besides, people only trust what they reach with their own feet. I looked down the stairway. At the stone shining softly in late afternoon light, I was afraid that if I stopped rehearsing, I would lose the best version of my future. "And what happened instead?" Madame Xu asked. I thought of the hospital, the deferred paper, my mother's thermos, the weight of true effort, the gate that no longer swallowed me, the score page loading under my father's trembling hand. "I found a real one," I said. "On the way home, I bought buns for my parents and a cheap blue windmill for no reason except that I could." At dinner, my father asked whether university students were allowed to become arrogant after admission. "Only in moderation," I said. My mother narrowed her eyes. "Don't float too high. Tsinghua accepted you, not the Jade Emperor." My father pointed his chopsticks at me. "And do not start looking down on your old school either. A person should remember where they learned to fail usefully." I grinned. "That sounds like something you invented just now." Most wisdom is invented on the spot. Later, when the dishes were done and the apartment had gone soft around the edges with evening, I stood by the window and watched the city lights come on one by one. There are still things I do not understand. I do not know whether the loop was dream, spirit, coma, trauma, divine intervention, or the last stubborn knot of a mind that refused to wake under unfinished fear.
I do not know why.
Some roads keep their names only in the mouths of people who loved them.
I do not know why.
A blind seal carver and a retired surveyor accepted my impossible story with less surprise than most. People accept a weather report. Maybe some questions are not meant to be solved cleanly. What I do know is simpler. I know that helplessness shrinks when walked through slowly enough. I know that repetition can teach you, but it cannot live for you.
I know that one missed.
Road does not erase a city. And I know this most of all. For a long time, I thought a great future was something you secured by finding the perfect answer before the world moved. Now, I think it might be something else. Something closer to this. You step forward while uncertain. You bring your own face. And if darkness comes, you learn the names of the roads that can still take you home.